Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Univ online talk, your opportunity to hear from our fellows who talk to you about their research and the issues that they're thinking about. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, can I remind you to put your questions in the Q&A, and I will try and take as many of them as possible. So let me introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Kouadio is a Beacon Junior Research Fellow in Postdoctoral and Race Studies at Univ. She obtained her doctorate in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, and she's currently working on two book projects. The first, titled Africanizing Transitional Justice, which is currently under review with Oxford University Press, and her second examines the international thought of the African Democratic Rally, a 20th century Pan-Africanist and anti-colonial Francophone movement. Tonight, Lynn will be talking about three anti-colonial leaders, examining how their intellectual and political trajectories were shaped and what their becoming might illuminate for international thought and politics today. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Valerie, for this wonderful opportunity to share some of my ongoing work, and to Emma, who so kindly liaised with me and organized everything. Many thanks to all of you for being here. I look forward to our short discussion after the presentation. So I'm just going to share my slides over here, which you should be able to see now. My talk today draws on a paper currently under review with Global Black Thought and forms part of a larger ongoing book project on the international thought of the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, the African Democratic Rally in English, which was founded in 1946 in Bamako, in what was then French Sudan, now Mali, and was one of the most significant Pan-Africanist and anti-colonial movements of the 20th century in Africa, and particularly Africa under French colonial rule. The paper is concerned with what it means to recover not only the important intellectual contributions of anti-colonial figures as illustrious individuals who transformed their societies subjected to the violence of colonial rule and helped shape anti-colonial politics on a global scale, but also, crucially, they are becoming Black internationalists and radical African intellectuals. The paper began with questions about the welcome and yet also perplexing renewed engagement with Frantz Fanon. Now, I realize that my slides are not quite up, so I'm going to try again very quickly here. So the paper began, as I was saying, with this perplexing renewed engagement with Frantz Fanon. My talk is not about Fanon, but I have been intrigued by the ways that he has become a shorthand for decolonization. He now regularly appears in curricula as part of attempts at intellectual decolonization and as a key thinker on what it means to grapple with the question of violence and anti-colonial struggles. The recent revival of his work, especially popular in English translations of his original in French, has been part of wider calls to decolonize and a renewed focus on recovering and recentering African and Afro-diasporic radical Black traditions of thought. The ongoing iteration of this call to decolonize and to recover these anti-colonial intellectual traditions can be traced to the fallist movements at South African universities, which, taking off decidedly in 2015, galvanized calls for epistemic justice at universities elsewhere in the world, especially at elite Anglo-American universities. The demands for curricular decolonization and for a more sustained critical engagement with questions of diversity and inclusion in both student and professorial bodies have helped enrich entire fields of academic study in international relations, international thought, political theory. Critical engagements with these questions have reinvigorated scholarly debate. the academic reception of books such as Robert Italis's White World Order, Black Power Politics, and Adam Getachews' World Making After Empire shows the appetite for continued engagement with questions of decolonization and the recovery of under-acknowledged and disappeared African and Afro-diasporic intellectual contributions, which were foundational to the emergence of entire fields of study. Furthermore, at the intersection of Black studies, Francophone studies, American studies, and intellectual history, recent work by scholars such as Annette Joseph Gabriel, Keisha Blaine, Mabula Sumaru, and many others has illuminated hitherto insufficiently examined pivotal practices and theoretical contributions of anti-colonial Black women, their negotiations of citizenship under colonial rule, and what it means to build and theorize the Black international. Crucially, all these interventions have helped illuminate the ways that alternative imaginaries for international order were pursued amidst very difficult and violent conditions of colonial rule and racial segregation. This recovery work has helped provide valuable insights into what it might mean to navigate contemporary global challenges. Of course, there's a critique that decolonization has become a bandwagon that some have joined, sometimes largely for career advancement with insufficient concern for the very real material and practical political implications and imperatives of decolonization. This critique is important. However, while such critiques are warranted, it is nonetheless difficult to discount the much needed conversations that have been brought back into sharp focus and that have been very productive for transformation in global higher education. It is important that this work around intellectual decolonization and the recovery of under-acknowledged radical intellectual traditions and anti-colonial contributions, particularly from Africa and Afro-diasporic worlds, which in fact transformed the world, continues. It is also important that what this recovery work centers, as well as how, be questioned. As evidenced by the renewed engagement with Fanon's work, it is often the case that illustrious anti-colonial figures and key contributors become recovered as individuated individuals. In so doing, recovery and recentering work can begin to operate according to logics of canonization, whereby Black radical intellectual figures can be recovered in ways that isolate them from the very solidaristic worlds that made them possible. Meanwhile, they are not prominent or key anti-colonial figures without these solidaristic communities. While it is indeed the case that individual contributions have been disappeared and merit recovery, it is even more so the case that it is these solidaristic communities that give individual contributions their force and significance in anti-colonial struggles, which have been erased and disappeared and merit recovery. What recovery work must therefore attend to is not only recentering individual contributions, but also the processes of becoming Black internationalists and African intellectuals through which anti-colonial figures acquired significance and prominence at all. I consider this becoming a two-pronged process. On the one hand, becoming Black internationalists entails a Black consciousness shaped by the experience of being racialized as Black in particular locations, as well as through witnessed incomparable experiences of racialization elsewhere in diaspora. On the other hand, becoming African intellectuals entails an anti-colonial and Pan-Africanist making and remaking of Africa. This two-pronged becoming is forged through solidaristic community marked by the mobility of people, cultural production, and translation work. These mobilities foster learning and becoming conscious of one's Blackness as well as other Blacknesses. This becoming in and through solidaristic communities also enabled through practices of calling in and calling out, which radical Black intellectual traditions are well versed in. This calling in and calling out means that disagreement and tensions are inherent to becoming Black internationalists and African intellectuals, such that prominence is never a given on grounds of supposed individual genius or merely because one might have written a remarkable book. Of course, individual contributions are valuable and important, but prominence and significance are always strategically conferred and withheld through processes of solidaristic recognition. When I invoke the Black international, I am, of course, drawing on the work of Jeanne Nardal, whose paper L'internationalisme noir, published in La Dépêche Africaine in 1928, was very much about grappling with what it meant to be Afro-diasporic in very specific locations across Afro-diasporic contexts and in the colonial metropole in the 20s, 30s, and onward. She and her sister, Paulette Nardal, came from a Martinican family that was at the heart of both the early days of the Negritude movement and therefore important to the making of Black internationalism in Black communities under French colonization. French Guyanese and Negritude poet Léon Damas, for instance, was taught English by the Nardal sisters' maternal grandfather, and his first marriage was to one of the Nardal sisters' relatives on their mother's side. His fluency in English, friendship with Aimé Césaire, acquaintanceship with all these families and circles in Martinique informed his Black consciousness. His commitment to Negritude and his political, cultural, and solidaristic choices across the Black worlds he was a part of, contributed to, and was shaped by in Harlem, New York, in Washington, D.C., in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, as an academic, as a journalist, and as a member of parliament in the French Fourth Republic, where he represented French Guyana and where he served as rapporteur for the parliamentary inquiry into the violence in Côte d'Ivoire in 48 and 49. All of this cannot be understood without this sort of becoming. While I have been encountering Léon-Gontran Damas, Gabriel and Bernard Dadié at various points in their lives and careers as important Black cultural figures and anti-colonial leaders, statesmen, through various archives strewn across various countries, I decided to organize my intervention in this paper around my auditory encounter with them together in the Damas papers at the Schumberg Center in New York. To encounter them together in Damas's audio recordings in particular truly was a memorable and powerful encounter of the affective kind. And I'm gesturing here toward Ghanaian academic Edwina Ashinikoi's work. It was quite a sonic experience to listen to Dadié, Damas, but also Césaire and Rabé Mananjara, whom I talk about a bit more in the paper, reading their poems. In listening to them, I caught a glimpse, as it were, of the solidaristic practice, not only of dedicating poems to one another, but also of listening to one another read them as part of a process of mutual anti-colonial education and edification. This was especially significant given that their poetry was both rooted in particular experiences of Blackness and committed to grappling with the commonalities in experiences of being racialized as Black in the world, as well as with the global significance of particular locations of anti-colonial struggles. Bernard Dadié was an Ivorian playwright, novelist, and Negritude poet, as well as an anti-colonial leader, part of the African Democratic Rally, that's the RDA. His father, Gabriel Dadié, who was also committed to the cause, died in 1953, very much engaged in the struggle. Bernard Dadié is deemed to be one of the pioneers of Ivorian literature and more generally an important Black Francophone literary figure. Gabriel Darboussier was Fua through his mother, who was from what was then French Sudan, now Mali, and his father was a white Frenchman. Darboussier grew up with his father's family and became a colonial administrator. He served in various parts of the French colonial empire in Africa, particularly Gabon, Moyen Congo, and served as a member of parliament in the French Fourth Republic as well. And he too was one of the core founding members of the African Democratic Rally, the RDA, and one of its core anti-colonial intellectuals. I focus on these men, Damas, Dadié, and Darboussier, rather than saying Césaire or Senghor, not because they were less important anti-colonial figures. Indeed, some of them were at times more prominent than Césaire, Senghor, who have since become far more central in academic scholarship. And I focus on them because their trajectories are particularly revealing of the processes through which Black internationalists and African intellectuals acquired significance and prominence in the first place. Part of what interests me is precisely that they were prominent figures, and yet they have not become or not been recovered as equally prominent in scholarship. And this is not just a matter of, we need to contextualize people better in a historic sense. It's also a question of becoming. To consider their trajectories in terms of becoming reveals that prominence does not emerge in a vacuum. It is generated, conferred, sustained through solidaristic communities. So to have Damas's papers at the Schönberg is neither fortuitous nor random. He spent a lot of time at the Schönberg during the years he spent in the US with African-American and other Afro-diasporic comrades teaching at various institutions, especially at Howard University. So in this sense, it makes sense that his private papers would be domiciled in Black intellectual spaces and institutions in the US. But a major reason why we even have this material is because of his second wife, Afro-Brazilian Marieta Campo, who's on the screen here, and she's, in the center of the picture wearing the white coat. Thus, the fact of Damas's papers being housed at the Schönberg is the outcome of the radical intentional work of Black internationalists. And then, of course, the private papers themselves provide profound insights into those whose acquaintanceship and friendship shaped his Black consciousness, his commitment to the Black international and to African intellectuals. But we would not have this were it not for her. And I'm still, finding out more about her. Now, this also matters because to have Black archives that enable us to delve into these histories is not straightforward, because a lot of these Black archives are routinely disappeared. Léa Mormain-Chauvac, whose book was on one of the previous slides, explains in her book, for instance, that we do not have similar records for the Nardal family because their house was, because they lost their house to a fire, and these records as well. And this also points me to a broader question about access and who gets to do this work. And this on the screen is taken from in mémoire de maîtrise, or dissertation, sort of like master's dissertation, from the former vice chancellor of Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Prof. Ibrahim Tube, for the academic year 1981-1982. And it was really interesting for me to encounter this and read this and think about the resonances today and what it means for me to be able to do this work. And again, broader questions around, what does it mean to continue to engage in the debates around repatriating colonial objects? And of course, these objects include archives. In a 4-part interview that Léon Damas gave in Côte d'Ivoire in the 70s as part of a televised series called Témoins de notre temps, Witnesses of Our Time, hosted by an Ivorian journalist and Senegalese anti-colonial and RDA leader, Doudou Gaye, Damas lifts the corner of the veil on the ways that his poetry anthology, Pigment, was a powerful anti-colonial, anti-war tool in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, and other parts of West and Central Africa under French colonial rule. His anthology was translated into Baoulé, which is a national Ivorian language, in the 30s, meaning that there were vibrant critical literary circles in these African countries, and they were participating in education and in tackling colonialism and making a case to say, if we're not fighting colonialism at home, why are we being mobilized to fight fascism abroad, particularly in the metropole? This cultural circulation was happening years before Damas ever set foot in Côte d'Ivoire in 1949 as part of the Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry into the repressive violence in Côte d'Ivoire at the time. And he was the rapporteur for this commission. And what's really interesting is that his prior work had contributed to the sort of anti-colonial politics that the colonial regime had, of course, violently repressed, and for which a parliamentary inquiry was set up, which he was a part of. And then he went on, of course, to do very important work there. And I've got another paper that I'm wrapping up that deals with the Damas report. But it was very interesting to hear him at the Schönberg talk about his experience arriving in Côte d'Ivoire in 1949. And he, says that it's very important to understand just how rampant colonially driven impoverishment was under colonial rule, but also just how the political climate in Côte d'Ivoire was ripe for an outright overthrow of colonial rule. And this is, of course, significant because at the time, of course, there was the anti-colonial war in Indochina, and of course what became called the Malagasy uprisings, but 47, 48, and of course Côte d'Ivoire 48, 49. And so, yeah, these are important dynamics. Now, I've said earlier that the Damas papers, bring us back to Marietta. With Bernard Dadié, there is no Bernard Dadié, there is no carnet de prison without the women who liberated him and their comrades from the Grand Bassam prison in 1949. These women included key organizers like Marie Corée, who is on the picture that's slightly, that's up there to the left, and who lost her life in the struggle. It is also important to consider that the recognition of these women in the struggle was happening in real time. And that is to say that these men, many of these men that are likelier to be rendered prominent in academic scholarship, not only knew this, but also worked closely with their women comrades whose organizing and strategizing they actively sought out. And it is important to engage this in recovery work because part of the problem is not simply that women were there and then forgotten. Rather, some forms of recovery can inadvertently sever ties that were not only constitutive of these men becoming Black internationalists and African intellectuals, but which they themselves acknowledged as integral to the struggle in real time. And this is why I'm thinking about, and through becoming, as I suggest, is important. It helps to retain these solidaristic communities that were constitutive of prominence and significance, those aspects being part and parcel of the struggle. And again, with Carnet de Prison, there's a newspaper clipping on the cover here of the book, and this is very much taken from that era. And it's again, it foregrounds one of the women that would have been part of the struggle, and that he basically not just owes his life to, but everything that he produces and for which he's recognized is tied to that. Women whose names, some of whom are named here, right? This is thanks to the work of Henriette Diabaté, an Ivorian historian, the first woman professor of history. But many, many more. And of course, Grand Bassam receives, attention, but there were other interventions at other prisons in Côte d'Ivoire, spearheaded by the women. And this sort of recognition that I'm talking about extended. So in 1986, there was a colloquium celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of the RDA. And as you can see here, you have some of the women that were still alive at the time who were honored and who were recognized. And the caption there basically indicates that they were at the forefront of the struggle as part of this African Democratic Rally right from the outset. And so it's really important, right, that to bear in mind that it's not just, after the fact that these women might be brought out of the archive and celebrated. It's that they were recognized as strategists and nonviolent revolutionaries at the forefront of the struggle, whom their, counterparts were learning from and learning in real time to take seriously as very important strategists. And this is interesting when we consider, I go back to Darboussier, because in as much as there's this sort of acknowledgement, that acknowledgement is most striking and prominent with African men. So with Darboussier, another leader that was called Ouezin Coulibaly, in a way that with Léon-Gontran Damas and Gabriel Lisette, there were tensions, right? There was, and in the Damas report that comes through, both him and Gabriel Lisette. Gabriel Lisette was another Caribbean, I believe he was Caribbean man, and he represented Chad, and was part of the RDA and did very important work there. but the misogynoir directed at Black African women was quite striking. But it's really interesting to see that sort of difference. Now we see there's a sort of learning that there's much to be learned, and you see it in the material that I've been reading. It's very interesting to witness that, and to appreciate how that ties in as well with his own process of grappling with what it meant to be a somebody that whose father was a white French man who worked for the colonial administration, and whose mother was Fula, but he didn't grow up with his mother's family. And so it's very interesting how he leans very much into his Africanness and grapples with it, and pushes back against some of his counterparts and his comrades, questioning the extent to which he understands the situation on the ground and the realities of African peasants and so on. And he leans very much into claiming not just having sort of Malian heritage, but being African. And, of course, he had represented and very much, engaged in very important anti-colonial work representing Congo. But subsequently, there's very much, this investment. He was minister for Senegal. This is post-independence, or in Senegal rather, post-independence. But it's remarkable to see the work he does within the RDA as part of this practice of claiming he's being African, but also this is a Pan-Africanist practice. And again, this is very much illustrative of his becoming in these contexts. It's very intimate, but also he's being questioned, he's being challenged, and it's really remarkable to see all of that in the archives. Now, he was particularly distressed. This is just an illustration there of the work he did as part of the RDA and with his writings, and how the tensions between him and Damas are also very, very interesting. But they also extend to Houphouët, who by 1950, of course, untethers the RDA from the French Communist Party. And this, of course, leads to significant fundamental changes within the movement. This is where also comrades such as Sékou Touré, resist and refuse. Oumniobé in Cameroon also, refuse. In Senegal, the RDA section there is also very much opposed to this, and rightly so, because if we came under duress, which of course led to this decision, and Damascene and him fell out for a few years. And this is a letter. So the letter on the screen here is a letter addressed to W.E.B. Du Bois, wherein Damascene talks about some of these challenges, indicating that Houphouët is both a victim and complicit in colonialism, right? But what's interesting is that by the time we get to Intime Réflexion, which is the other the image to the right there have been undisclosed conversations between Gabriel Damascene and Félix Houphouët-Boigny, such that there's some sort of reconciliation. So he's still there. Damascene still disapproves of the decision that Houphouët, made. But there seems to be an understanding of the complexities and the contradictions sometimes in the context, of course, of the struggle against colonial rule. So the trajectories through which these people are seen when we encounter them in one another's work and in the archive indicate that there is a purpose to the archiving, purpose to the encounters, to the preservation of exchange letters, to movement, to a sense of urgency around anti-colonial resistance. To consider becoming is to acknowledge that in scholarship, in research, and in the archives, we do not encounter their thought as fully formed, plucked out of their genius, and then put in conversation with other similarly brilliant individuals waiting to be brought out of the archives. Rather, their work and their appearance in one another's work evidence their own and other people's becoming Black internationalists and African intellectuals. This two-pronged becoming entails learning, teaching, recognition in community, the strategic conferral of prominence in community, the continuous tethering and retethering diaspora to continental Africa through anti-colonial solidaristic community, and practices of accountability through calling out and calling in. The stakes of considering becoming are therefore multiple. It helps us consider archives and individual contributions on their own terms in historical context, but also and crucially in terms of solidaristic community. It also helps us consider that the ongoing onslaught against Black culture and radical intellectual life in the US, as well as the more general attack on higher education beyond the US, is not entirely dissimilar to the neoliberal onslaught against the developmental state in Africa and its deleterious effects on higher education on the continent. The implications were and are not only national, they also reveal the ways that the solidaristic bonds and practices sustain and enabling becoming Black internationalists and African intellectuals so crucial for what they have helped generate intellectually and culturally and so on, as I've discussed throughout this talk, are very much targeted and needing recovery. Thank you very much.
Lynn, a huge thank you for that absolutely fascinating insight into what was happening, particularly in terms of Francophone political activists and intellectuals, and for really locating the central role of women within this building of what you call solidaristic communities. Emma will read the questions in a moment, but I wanted to start really by asking you a question about geography and identity. Because you focus particularly on Francophone Africa, on the links to the Caribbean and to South America through French Guiana to the United States, of course, obviously France as the colonial power. Where did Anglophone Africa and Britain fit into this, given that it was the building of an international community? And particularly when you answer this, can you touch on geography and identity?
Yeah, thank you so much, Valerie, for this really important, rich question. I think it's through movement, and of course, in the image I had up here of Darboussier's réflexion, intime réflexion. It's really interesting to see this movement, and I think there are lots of parts there that are missing. I'm yet to go into the archives at New College because apparently he gave a talk there at some point, right? And there was incredible movement, of course, through exchanging letters and so on and so forth. But the physical movement across geographies, right? And that was intentional. It was, of course, people went to Paris, let's say, to study. People like Gabriel did not. Bernard Dadié did not study in Paris, but studied at William Ponty in Dakar. Somebody like Léon-Gontran Damas studied in Martinique, studied in Paris, but spent quite a bit of time in the US, right? So there's this, constant movement that is part and parcel of building community, of learning from one another and understanding what's going on where. And they're always keeping abreast of what is being produced from these communities, right? And that's part of their solidarity. And so the movement, the cultural exchanges, right, the circulation of material, literature, and so on, as well as their own movements, are very much about learning. So it's not just, we're going out there to liberate people, right? It is we're going to learn and to engage and to share, and it's that practice, right? And so circulation through Britain was very much, of course, a part of that, but in that kind of vision. Yeah.
Thank you. But they didn't always agree. So how did they handle different?
Yeah, so I think that's one thing I've been finding fascinating. It shouldn't be fascinating in the sense that it's true of us today, right? But I think one thing that's really remarkable is that disagreement doesn't then mean we sever ties and we let you go, right? It is we are trying to make sense of what's going on because we understand that the struggle is complex and that people are positioned in very peculiarly difficult positions at times, right? So somebody like Darboussier didn't have the same kinds of challenges than, say, Dadié or even Houphouët, right? Now, this is not, of course, to excuse, the fact that, they had agency and, people like Houphouët did sell out, right? But there was a sort of understanding that we need to probe that. And so when Dawissi tells W.E.B. Du Bois, right, that, Houphouët is basically between a rock and a hard place, there's that understanding, right, that we need to be nuanced. So I disagree, yes, and I'm keeping that position. But I also understand that there's a struggle here and their objectives are trying to pursue. It's not linear, it's messy, it's complicated, because they also lost very real comrades, right, who actually died, right? Marie Curie, for instance, died liberating her husband and other men who were incarcerated, right? And many more died. And this is just in Côte d'Ivoire, right? We're not even talking about Guinea, Madagascar, and so on and so forth, right? So disagreement was always understood within, this sense that we need to hold together what the ideals are. What does it even mean to sell out? Like, what's the context there? And who are people who are just not interested? Because there was that too, and they don't appear as much at all, right? Who were like, nah, this is not about, no, I'm not about this cause, right? But those who were engaged were navigating, very real challenges. And of course, for, the kind of work I'm doing, there's always the benefit of hindsight, right? And yes, I'm always sort of grappling. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm ambivalent here. These characters are ambivalent. Like, how do we make sense of that? But yeah, it matters, of course, because this is where the histories of the Black world, of anti-colonial struggles, and the making of worlds that are, anti-colonial come from. So yeah.
And how did they, given what they were seeking to do, and particularly to think about Africanness, Blackness, and so on, how did they engage with, for example, French political and philosophical ideas at that time?
Yeah, they were very open, right, and they were actively learning. So of course, I focus here very much on the Black circles, right, that all these figures would have been a part of. But they were very, very engaged with their peers and contemporaries who were not Black, right, who were, white French men, women. The African Democratic Rally itself was working closely with the French Communist Party before, things, were interrupted or ruptured. But also a lot of these leaders were, and this is the other thing that's really interesting, were that they were engaged with various parties because they understood the importance of building coalitions to get very specific legislation through Parliament and so on and so forth, right, in the case of those who were in Parliament. But in terms of cultural production, they were very much involved with the left in France, in, wherever they went, right? And so they were, invested in mobilizing support amongst white populations that understood World War II, right? And to be like, you were fighting against fascism. Those of you who were, this is what has been happening to us out of, your governments. You need to be aware so that you know where you stand, right? And that you can make informed decisions. And so there was very much that sort of open, but they were always grappling with what that meant, right? And of course, this transpires in Jean Nardez and Baudet Nardez sort of work. There's a sense of oh, what is it? Yeah, okay, we're French. What does that mean, considering that we're racialized as Black and we're victims of, oppression? We're elites back home and we're very privileged back home, but then we land in the metropole. This is what we're subjected to. And then there's a sense of like, oh yeah, no, let's actually travel to Africa. And then it's like, oh, but in Africa, there are these other dynamics. Yes, we're all Black, but we're coming from the diaspora. We are évolué, right? We speak French, we have access. And so what does it mean to navigate that? So there's always a sense of like, oh, what does it mean to be African, to be Afro-diasporic in various locations and vis-a-vis communities that are differently racialized, right? So.
Thank you. One last question from me. What would you consider to be their legacy today? if you look at, intellectual movements, if you look at political movements, you talked about Fanon being a kind of, father figure almost in relation to this. What is the trajectory, as it were, or through from Fanon through these solidaristic communities to today?
I would say, and this is them and beyond as well, that Pan-Africanism won't go away, right? It's an incredibly powerful intellectual and political force in the world. I mean, I started the talk the way I did because there are moments that sort of step back and I'm like, we will understand the moment we're in a bit better, right? In time and with time. But I find it absolutely incredible that over not just decades, at this stage, I think we're going into centuries, right, of sustained learning, active learning, a process of engaging with what has come before, what have people left before, so that we understand what it means to be anti-colonial, to be anti-racist today. And I think this staying power, intellectually, politically, whereby there is a commitment to, nonviolent resistance, for instance, to transforming universities. Like students literally fill seats where certain, topics are being discussed. I feel like that's incredibly powerful, and it speaks, I think, of a resilient idea, and that just keeps on being renewed. I mean, of course, we can talk about the Sahel, but again, there's this re-engagement and enthusiastic re-engagement with Pan-Africanism once again, right? And grappling with, okay, how do we make sure that we are non-violent, but we're grappling with very real material and political conditions. So for me, it's the staying power of Pan-Africanism.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we have a question in the chat and we are pretty much out of time, but it's from Paul. Emma, do you want to read the question?
Yes, of course I can. So this one's from Paul. He said, firstly, excellent talk, Lynn. And then my question touches on Valerie's earlier point on disagreement. Tensions did exist, as you said, and there was obviously much opposition from without. Keeping in mind the pluralism of the regions across which the Rassemblement organised, could the RDA have continued as a movement all the way through the independences till today? Were those tensions their undoing, or was that dwarfed by the struggle against the metropole itself and its associated opposition?
Wow, it's quite a question. Thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure whether the movement would have endured as it was, but I'm also thinking that the movement had various parts to it. So there were all these territorial that's what they call them, territorial sections. And these territorial sections, carried on, right? And then, of course, the lead up to independence of 1950 to 58 first, and then 58 to 60 did change what it is that the focus was on, because, of course, it was now independence, the transfer of power from the colonial power to independent states and so on. So, the focus on the nation state, became, took center stage with a lot of these leaders. However, I think what the movement was trying to do, whereby there was this sort of, I'm using federation very loosely here, right? But this idea that there was there's an awareness, or an acute awareness of this space definitely within Africa, right? That is Francophone Africa, whereby there is a sense that, when things are going on in Senegal, in various communities, say in Côte d'Ivoire or in Cameroon, people pay attention, right? Or, things might be going on in Côte d'Ivoire and people in Cameroon pay attention, and so on and so forth. I think that is a legacy of the work that this movement did to center African questions or things that might be going on the specific locations as having resonance elsewhere, because it's the same thing. And that's why I'm saying I'm focusing on this, but this is of course part of the broader sort of Pan-Africanist pursuits that, you know, people associate more readily with the Kwame Nkrumahs and so on and so forth, right? But this consciousness, this sense that, you know, what is happening over there in, you know, given African Francophone country is relevant or concerns, you know, another part of you know, these subregions colonized by France. I think that is that has endured, and that matters to understand the politics even of the region today, right? You know, people are very much following what's going on in the Sahel, right? For across Africa, but particularly in Black Francophone Africa, well, West and Central Francophone Africa. So I don't know if that really gets at the question, but yeah.
Lynn, thank you so much. We are out of time. Can I thank everyone for joining us this evening? We'll let you know when we have our next online talk. But Lynn, thank you again. An absolutely fascinating talk. And I like this concept of becoming. It covers a lot. So we look forward to reading your books in the future. Once again, thank you, everyone, and good night or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Valerie.